It sits at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street in a photograph from 1894. An Italian palazzo, 4 stories of rough stone blocks with Renaissance-inspired windows on the upper floors, rising at what was then the most fashionable address in New York. The photograph captures the palazzo from across the street, where another mansion stands, larger, more ornate, a Gothic chateau designed by the same architect for Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The irony would not have been lost on anyone who understood New York society in the Gilded Age. The same man designed both houses, the same corner, 2 families with fortunes built on railroads. But only one family received invitations to Mrs. Caroline Astor's balls. Inside the palazzo at No. 2 East 57th Street, a state dining room climbed 3 stories. Italian hand-carved wood paneled the walls. The ceiling curved overhead with gilt accents and murals painted by artists imported from Europe. 214 paintings hung in the picture gallery by 1900, including 2 works by Rembrandt, one by Vermeer, and canvases by the most celebrated artists of the age. In a bathroom that cost $15,000 to build, perfumed water flowed from silver spigots into a bathtub carved from solid black onyx. The woman who built it, who filled it with treasures, who hosted presidents in her dining room, was called the richest woman in America. Her name was Arabella Huntington. She would never receive an invitation to the parties happening in the mansion across the street. Mrs. Caroline Astor, who controlled access to New York society with the authority of a medieval queen, never left her calling card at No. 2. Without that card, you did not exist in society. Without that card, your palazzo might as well have been invisible. The 400, the list of people who mattered in Gilded Age New York, the list that Mrs. Astor published in the New York Times in February of 1892, never included Arabella's name. She had spent $2.5 million building a palace to force her way into the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. The construction took 5 years. The interior decoration took longer. Every detail was calculated to demonstrate culture, taste, and belonging. What she discovered was that no amount of money could buy what she wanted most. This is the story of a woman who escaped a gambling parlor in Richmond, Virginia, became wealthier than the Vanderbilts, and built the most expensive private residence in New York to prove her worth to people who had already decided she had none. It is about the palazzo she built as a weapon in a war she could never win. It is about what money could buy in America and what it could not. Before we discover how she tried to build her way into society, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind America's great mansions, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to where it started. Richmond, Virginia, 1867. The city had not yet recovered from the war. Confederate veterans walked streets that still showed scorch marks from the fires of April 1865. Catherine Yarrington ran a boarding house in a rough stretch of the city where legitimate hotels stood next to establishments that advertised rooms by the hour. Gambling dens operated within sight of the old slave auction houses that now stood empty. Their purpose rendered obsolete, but their presence a reminder of what the city had been. Catherine's husband, Richard Milton Yarrington, a machinist, had died 8 years earlier in 1859, leaving her with children to feed and bills to pay. She supported her family by renting rooms to travelers and businessmen passing through what had been the Confederate capital. The neighborhood was not respectable. It was what she could afford. A few blocks away, on a street where the gas lamps burned late into the night, John Worsham owned an illegal faro parlor. Faro was a betting game, simple in mechanics, but profitable for the house. Men came to Worsham's establishment because they liked cards, they liked risk, and they liked the atmosphere of a place where money changed hands quickly and questions were not asked. The house was known. You could find it if you wanted to. Arabella Duval Yarrington, Catherine's daughter, worked there. She had been born around 1850 or 1851, probably in Richmond, though she would claim different birthplaces throughout her life depending on which story served her better at the time. Birth records from that era were unreliable, particularly for families without money or status. and Arabella would use that ambiguity to her advantage for decades. What contemporaries noted, what appeared in letters and diaries written by people who met her, was her extraordinary beauty. They described her as striking, with dark eyes and features that commanded attention when she entered a room. They noted her intelligence, which manifested in conversation sharp enough to hold the attention of men twice her age, and they noted a quality they struggled to define, settling on phrases like magnetic charm or compelling presence. She had something that made people notice her. What they did not note, because it was obvious to anyone who saw where she lived and how she dressed, was her poverty. Collis Potter Huntington frequented the area. He was a railroad baron 32 years older than Arabella, and by 1867, he controlled more miles of track than almost anyone in America. His business brought him to Richmond regularly. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, which he would purchase in 1869, ran through Virginia. He had reason to be in the city. He also had reason to visit establishments like Worsham's, where men of business gathered in rooms where contracts were discussed over cards and whiskey. He noticed Arabella. How could he not? A woman that striking in that place, with that intelligence visible in her eyes. He noticed. What happened between them in Richmond is documented only by what came after. The timeline is clear even if the details are not. In 1869, Arabella left Richmond. She traveled to New York at the age of 19, pregnant, claiming to be the wife of John Worsham. Worsham accompanied her on the journey. He lived with her in New York for approximately 1 year, though no marriage record has ever been found. Then he returned to Richmond to his wife, Annette, to whom he had been legally married the entire time. Some records suggest Worsham may have been married to a woman named Mary as well, though the documentation is unclear. What is clear is that he was never married to Arabella. She began telling people she was a widow. John Worsham would not die until 1878. On March 10, 1870, Arabella gave birth to a son in New York. She named him Archer Milton Worsham. The baby weighed 11 pounds, a detail she would mention throughout his childhood as evidence of his strength and vitality. She would remain intensely devoted to him for the rest of her life, protective in a way that suggested she understood exactly how precarious their position was. She was 19 years old. She had an infant son, no husband, no family in New York, and a story about being a widow that anyone who cared to investigate could disprove with a letter to Richmond. What she also had was the interest of Collis Potter Huntington, and that would prove to be worth more than any truth she had left behind. Collis Potter Huntington was born in Harwinton, Connecticut on October 22, 1821, into a family with more children than money. His father was a tinker, traveling from town to town repairing household goods. Collis left home at 14 to work as a farm laborer, then as a peddler, then as a merchant's assistant. He learned business the way most poor boys learned it, by necessity, by watching, by understanding that money was the only reliable path out of poverty. By 1867, when he met Arabella in Richmond, he controlled an empire that would reshape the American West. The empire had started with an observation about human nature and an understanding of basic economics. In 1849, when news of gold discoveries in California reached the East Coast, tens of thousands of men sold everything they owned to travel west and make their fortunes. Most of them failed. Collis understood something that most of them did not. The real money was not in mining gold. The real money was in selling picks and shovels to miners, food to hungry prospectors, and supplies to settlers who arrived with nothing but hope. He sailed to California in 1849, not to mine, but to open a store. In Sacramento, he partnered with Mark Hopkins, a careful accountant who shared his understanding that consistent profits were better than risky speculation. They established a wholesale business that supplied miners and settlers throughout the territory. They made money while miners went broke. In 1861, an engineer named Theodore Judah walked into their store with an ambitious plan. Judah had been surveying routes through the Sierra Nevada mountains for years, trying to solve the problem of how to build a railroad across terrain that seemed impossible to cross. He needed investors. He needed men willing to put money into a project that might fail, that would certainly take years, and that required political connections in Washington to secure federal subsidies and land grants. Judah recruited 4 Sacramento merchants. The merchants were Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and Charles Crocker. They would become known as the Big Four, though they preferred to call themselves the Associates. They incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad in June of 1861 and set out to build the western portion of the first transcontinental railroad. Collis became the group's political operator and financial strategist. While the others managed construction and operations in California, he went to Washington and New York to secure financing and favorable legislation from Congress. The methods he used were not subtle. He bribed politicians. He bribed them systematically with cash, with stock shares, with promises of future considerations. He manipulated land grants, securing millions of acres of public land that the railroad could sell to settlers. He exploited tax subsidies, convincing Congress to provide loans that would never be fully repaid. He forged financial documents. He lied about construction costs. He created shell companies to funnel money from the railroad's coffers into the private accounts of the Big Four. Contemporary critics called them the greatest swindlers in United States history. The critics were not wrong. The Central Pacific Railroad met the Union Pacific Railroad at Promontory, Utah in May of 1869. A golden spike was driven into the final tie. Photographs were taken. Speeches were made. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. Telegraph wires carried the news across the country within minutes. The accomplishment was real. The corruption that had made it possible was also real. Collis did not stop. In 1865, before the transcontinental line was even finished, the Big Four had formed the Southern Pacific Railroad to build lines down through Southern California and across the Southwest toward New Orleans. By the 1880s, the Southern Pacific stretched 9,600 miles, from San Francisco to New Orleans, from Portland to Los Angeles. It was the largest railroad network in the western United States. Collis bought the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway in 1869 and extended it eastward to link with the Southern Pacific System, creating 4,000 continuous miles from San Francisco to Newport News, Virginia. He controlled shipping on both coasts. He controlled land in 6 states. He controlled the movement of goods and people across half the continent. He became one of the wealthiest men in America. Estimates of the combined Huntington family fortune, adjusted for inflation, range between $30 and $50 billion. By the early 1870s, he was spending most of his time in New York, managing the political side of the empire from an office in Manhattan. His wife, Elizabeth Stoddard Huntington, whom he had married in 1844, was ill. She had never been strong. She grew weaker. And Arabella, newly arrived from Richmond with an infant son and a fabricated story about a dead husband, needed a place to live. Collis set Arabella up in a series of fine homes in New York. The official story, the story that Arabella told anyone who asked, was that she had been hired to care for his ailing wife, Elizabeth. She presented herself as a caretaker, a companion, someone employed to ease the burden of a sick woman's final years. The reality was more complicated. Collis provided her with houses on West 54th Street and later on 65 Park Avenue. These were not the addresses where servants lived. These were substantial residences in good neighborhoods. He gave her seed money for investments, not a salary, not a wage, capital. In the late 1870s and 1880s, Arabella made millions in real estate and securities transactions. She bought properties in Manhattan when neighborhoods were still developing, then sold when values rose. She invested in railroad stocks using information that came from being close to Collis, understanding which lines would prosper and which would fail. She competed in deals against William Henry Vanderbilt and John Davison Rockefeller. She won often enough to become independently wealthy. By the 1880s, she had her own fortune, separate from anything Collis gave her directly. She was not dependent. She had made herself essential, but she had also made herself independent. It was a careful balance. While building her fortune, she educated herself with the intensity of someone who understood that money alone would not be enough. She taught herself to speak French fluently, hiring tutors and practicing until she could discuss art and literature in Paris without revealing her origins. She studied architecture and art history, not casually, but with the focus of someone preparing for an examination that would determine her future. She visited museums. She read catalogs. She memorized the names of artists and the dates of movements and the characteristics that distinguished one period from another. She began collecting art, starting with progressive French landscapes from the Barbizon School, works by Corot, Daubigny, and Rousseau. She bought aesthetic movement furnishings made by Herder Brothers, the most fashionable interior design firm in New York. She was teaching herself to be cultured because she understood that culture was a language the wealthy spoke, and if she wanted to be accepted, she needed to speak it fluently. Everyone who saw Archer Milton noticed his resemblance to Collis. The boy looked like him to a remarkable degree. He had Collis's features, his build, the same set to his jaw. As Archer grew older, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. No one in New York society believed the story about John Worsham. They knew. They whispered about it in drawing rooms and at dinner parties. The mistress and the boy who looked like Huntington. The caretaker story fooled no one. Elizabeth Stoddard Huntington died in 1883 in New York. She had been ill for years. The death was not unexpected. Collis married Arabella in 1884 in San Francisco, far from the city where everyone knew what the arrangement had been. The ceremony was discreet. He was 63. She was 34, though she claimed to be younger. After the marriage, Collis legally adopted Archer, who was by then 14 years old. The adoption gave the boy the Huntington name and formalized what everyone already understood. Archer was his son. The marriage gave Arabella something she had never had: legitimacy, respectability, the Huntington name. She had access to a fortune that grew larger every year. She had a mansion in San Francisco and invitations to events in California, where society was newer and more willing to overlook irregular pasts. But in New York, where society was older and memories were longer, Mrs. Carolyn Astor still did not leave her calling card. By 1889, 5 years into the marriage, Arabella Huntington had decided to build something that would make it impossible to ignore her. She would build the finest house in New York. She would fill it with treasures. She would host presidents and senators and railroad executives. She would demonstrate that she belonged. And if New York society still refused to acknowledge her, it would not be because her house was inferior or her collection was inadequate or her entertaining was lacking. It would be because they chose not to, and that choice would reveal more about them than about her. In 1889, Collis and Arabella Huntington purchased a large property on the southeast corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. The purchase price has not been recorded, but the location tells you everything you need to know about the cost. It was the most fashionable residential address in New York. 5th Avenue was where the wealthiest families built their mansions. 57th Street was the crossroads of society. The location sat directly across the street from the massive chateau that Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built between 1879 and 1894. The Vanderbilt mansion would eventually consume the entire block between 57th and 58th Streets. It was the largest private residence in New York. Arabella bought the property that faced it. They hired George Browne Post to design their house. Post had been born in 1837 in Manhattan. He had studied civil engineering at New York University and trained under Richard Morris Hunt, who was, by the 1880s, the most prominent residential architect in America. Hunt designed houses for the Vanderbilts. Post had learned from him. By 1889, Post was president of the American Institute of Architects and one of the busiest architects in the country. His clients included the wealthiest families in New York: the Cornelius Vanderbilt family, the Colgate family, the Pulitzer family. He had designed office buildings that redefined urban architecture, including the Western Union Building, the Produce Exchange, and the New York Times Building. He designed structures that rose as high as 20 stories when most buildings topped out at 6. He was the best. Arabella hired the best. The commission Post had completed just before the Huntington project was the mansion for Cornelius Vanderbilt II. That house, an English Jacobean Gothic chateau built from limestone and brick, stood at the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. Post had designed it in partnership with Richard Morris Hunt between 1879 and 1882, creating 137 rooms spread across 5 stories. Between 1892 and 1894, the Vanderbilts hired Post to enlarge it, adding another 57 rooms and extending the structure until it consumed the entire block. Now Post would design the house that would face it directly across the intersection. The same architect. The same corner. two families with fortunes built on railroads. One family received by Mrs. Astor, one family not. Post designed an Italian Renaissance palazzo for the Huntingtons. The style was deliberate. Where the Vanderbilt mansion looked north to England and Gothic revival, the Huntington Palazzo looked south to Italy and the Renaissance. It would be classical. It would be restrained. It would demonstrate that Arabella understood European culture, that she knew the difference between a French chateau and an Italian palazzo, that she could speak the architectural language of the educated elite. The structure would rise on 5 lots combined into a single property. The exterior would be built from rough stone blocks quarried and shipped from Italy. Renaissance-inspired openings on the 2nd and 3rd floors would be framed in carved stone. The proportions would be mathematical, calculated according to classical ratios. Every detail would be correct. Construction began in 1889. It would take 5 years to complete. 5 years of masons laying stone, 5 years of craftsmen carving details, 5 years of Arabella working with Post and his team to ensure that every element was perfect. The total cost came to $2.5 million, approximately $75 million in current value. It was one of the most expensive private residences ever built in New York. The money bought stone from Italy. It bought craftsmen from Europe. It bought time. It bought perfection. Arabella hired the finest artists she could find to decorate the interior. She hired Elihu Vedder, an American symbolist painter who had studied in Paris and Rome, to paint romantic murals on the walls and ceilings. Vedder's work filled museums. He was famous. She paid him to paint her walls. She hired Italian craftsmen to carve wood panels by hand, working from designs she approved personally. She hired specialists in gilt work, in plaster, in marble, in glass. Every room received the same attention. Every detail was considered. Nothing was left to chance. The bathroom that Arabella designed for herself cost $15,000 to build around 1893. The New York Times would later describe it as Diana's Pool, naming it after the Roman goddess of the hunt. The bathtub was carved from a single massive piece of black onyx, polished until it gleamed. The floors were black onyx. Persian rugs, purchased from dealers who imported them from Tehran and Isfahan, covered sections of the marble. Blue striped tiles from Portugal lined the walls. A conservatory garden was visible through the windows so Arabella could see white orchids and gardenias while she bathed. The water that flowed from the silver spigots was perfumed with attar of roses, an essential oil so expensive that it was measured by the drop. She kept the finest French soaps, lavender from Grace, violet from Paris, rose from gardens outside Lyon. Fresh flowers arrived daily from the florist, white orchids, white gardenias, lily of the valley. The bathroom cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. It was one room in a house with more than 50 rooms. By 1894, the palazzo was finished. It rose 4 stories at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street, Italian stone facing the Vanderbilt Gothic chateau across the way. The construction had taken 5 years. The interior decoration would continue for years more as Arabella acquired furnishings and art. But the structure was complete. The palazzo existed. Now Arabella would find out if it had been enough. Now she would discover whether architecture could accomplish what money alone could not. The state dining room rose 3 stories through the center of the house. You entered it and looked up, your eyes drawn to a ceiling 30 feet overhead. Italian hand-carved wood paneled the walls from floor to ceiling, dark walnut carved in patterns that echoed the decorative schemes of Renaissance palaces in Florence and Rome. The ceiling curved overhead with gilt accents and a magnificent mural painted by the finest artists Arabella could hire. The mural depicted classical scenes, gods and goddesses in gardens, the kind of imagery that educated people recognized from their studies of mythology and art history. A massive fireplace occupied the center of the long room, carved from marble imported from Italy, large enough to burn logs 4 feet long. The mantel was decorated with carved figures, cherubs, scrollwork, family crests designed by a heraldic artist Arabella hired to create symbols that would suggest old lineage, even though the Huntington and Yarrington families had none. French Louis Fourteenth dining chairs surrounded a table that could accommodate 50 guests. The chairs had been designed in the style of the furniture at Versailles, with green velvet backs and seats and gilt carved legs. Each chair was a small work of art. 50 of them surrounding a table that stretched the length of the room created an impression of wealth, so vast it could be spent on objects that existed solely to be sat upon for a few hours during dinner. The architectural record documented the room in May of 1903, noting that it was called the State Dining Room because it was used to entertain presidents. Collis Huntington had hosted Ulysses Grant at that table. William Howard Taft had dined there. Theodore Roosevelt had sat in one of those gilt chairs and eaten from plates rimmed in gold. The designation State Dining Room was not honorary. It was factual. The family dining room occupied a separate space on the second floor, more intimate in scale. This was where the Huntingtons ate when they were not performing for political guests or business associates. Elihu Vedder had painted a mural over the fireplace in this room, a romantic scene of figures in a landscape, softer and more personal than the grand mythological scenes in the state dining room. The table sat 12. The chairs were comfortable. This was the room where Arabella ate breakfast with Archer, where she and Collis discussed business, where the performance of society could be set aside for a few hours. Beyond the dining rooms, down a gallery lined with sculpture purchased from dealers in Rome and Paris, stood the Picture Gallery. By 1900, the insurance inventory listed 214 paintings. Arabella had spent 6 years building the collection, working with dealers like Duveen Brothers and Knoedler Gallery, attending auctions in New York and Paris, purchasing works by artists whose names carried weight in society. The collection included 2 works by Rembrandt, portraits purchased from European aristocrats who needed to sell family heirlooms to pay debts. It included 1 painting by Vermeer, acquired through a dealer who specialized in old masters. It included multiple canvases by William Adolphe Bouguereau, the French academic painter whose works sold for the highest prices in the 1890s. It included landscapes by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot and portraits by Joshua Reynolds. The paintings hung salon-style, covering the walls from floor to molding, arranged by size and subject in the manner of European galleries. Arabella kept detailed records. She knew what she had paid for each painting. She knew the provenance of each work, who had owned it previously, how it had come to market, whether it had been exhibited in museums or salons. She could discuss the paintings with anyone who visited. She could explain why Bouguereau's technique represented the pinnacle of academic painting, why Corot's landscapes bridged Romanticism and Impressionism, why Reynolds's portraits captured the English aristocracy at the height of its power. She had taught herself. She had studied. She could speak the language. The basement held facilities that resembled the most expensive spa hotels in Europe. Turkish baths occupied one section, a steam room lined with tiles imported from Istanbul, heated benches covered in marble, brass fixtures shaped like lion heads. A heated plunge pool, large enough to swim in, filled another section. The pool was lined with tile mosaics depicting aquatic scenes, dolphins and fish and waves. There were treatment rooms where visiting masseuses could work. There were massage rooms with tables covered in fine linen. There were dressing rooms with mirrors and wardrobes. There were exercise facilities, mechanical devices for stretching and strengthening, weights, equipment that doctors recommended for health and vigor. A fireplace warmed a seating nook where one could rest between treatments. The basement spa was larger than most people's homes. It was a facility designed for a level of luxury that few Americans could imagine. The household staff numbered between 18 and 25 live-in servants at any given time. Records from 1916 and 1917 show 21 people employed at the residence: a butler, an under-butler, a housekeeper, ladies' maids, housemaids, laundry maids, kitchen maids, cooks, footmen, a valet for Collis, and various specialized servants whose jobs had names that most Americans did not recognize. There was a servant whose sole responsibility was polishing silver. There was a servant who maintained the flowers in the public rooms. There was a servant who managed the wine cellar. Each servant had a uniform. Each had assigned duties. Each knew their place in a hierarchy as rigid as any in European aristocracy. The Huntingtons maintained a garage down the street at 145 to 147 East 57th Street to house their automobiles. By the early 1900s, they owned several cars, electric vehicles for city driving, gasoline-powered cars for longer trips. They also employed a coachman named J.F. Bennett, who maintained horses and a carriage for Mrs. Huntington's use in the city. Arabella preferred the carriage for social calls. It was traditional. It was what society women used. Automobiles were still novelties, carriages were correct. The inventory list ran to pages. 214 paintings, hundreds of pieces of furniture, tapestries, sculpture, silver services, china, crystal, clocks, rugs. Every object had been purchased deliberately. Every object sent a message. The state dining room could host 50 guests. The staff numbered more than 20. The palazzo declared arrival. Arabella had built exactly what she intended, a palace that proved she understood culture, that demonstrated she had taste, that showed she possessed the refinement required of someone who belonged in New York society. Whether New York society would walk through the door was the only question left. Whether Mrs. Caroline Astor would acknowledge her existence was the test that would determine whether the $2.5 million had purchased anything beyond architecture. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor was born in 1830 into New York's Dutch aristocracy. Her family was not merely wealthy. Wealth could be acquired. Her family was old. That could not be acquired. Her family descended from the original settlers who had established the colony of New Amsterdam in the 1600s, before it became New York, before the English took it, before there was a United States of America. The Schermerhorns had been in New York for 2 centuries. They had watched waves of immigrants arrive. They had watched fortunes rise and fall. They remained. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, had built a fortune in the shipping trade, expanding on wealth that previous generations had accumulated through land ownership and mercantile businesses. At the time of Caroline's birth in 1830, he was worth $500,000, a sum that placed the family among the wealthiest in New York. Caroline was raised in a mansion on Lafayette Place with servants and tutors and the absolute certainty that she belonged to a class above ordinary people. She learned French and music and dancing and the elaborate rules that governed polite society. She learned who mattered and who did not. She learned that birth determined everything. She married William Backhouse Astor, Jr. in 1853. The Astor family controlled a real estate empire built on land purchases made in the 1700s and early 1800s, when Manhattan was still mostly farmland and swamps. William's great-grandfather, John Jacob Astor, had bought hundreds of lots in areas that later became the most valuable commercial and residential districts in the city. The family's wealth was measured in tens of millions of dollars. The Astors were wealthy. The Schermerhorns were old. The combination gave Caroline a position that no amount of new money could purchase. She had wealth and lineage. She had everything that mattered. By the 1870s, after her mother-in-law died in 1872, Caroline Astor had appointed herself the sole arbiter of who belonged in New York society and who did not. No one elected her. No one asked her to assume the role. She simply declared it, and because she had the Schermerhorn lineage and the Astor fortune and the absolute confidence that comes from being told your entire life that you are superior to other people, society accepted her authority. She worked in partnership with Ward McAllister, a Southern-born social climber who had married money and spent his life studying the rules that governed European aristocracy. McAllister codified the rules that would govern New York's elite for the next 3 decades. Together, he and Mrs. Astor created a system as rigid as any in Europe. The 400 was their masterpiece. The number came from the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom at her residence at 350 Fifth Avenue. McAllister explained the logic in interviews with reporters. Only 400 people in New York mattered. Only 400 people were worth knowing. If you could fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, you were one of them. If you could not, you were nobody. The arbitrary nature of the number, determined by architecture rather than any rational criteria, did not seem to bother anyone. It was exclusive. That was the point. On February 16, 1892, the New York Times published the official list. Ward McAllister had provided the names to the newspaper, and the Times printed all of them across multiple columns on the society pages. The list included bankers, lawyers, brokers, real estate men, and railroad executives. It included a mix of what society called knobs and swells. The knobs were old money, families like the Astors, the Goeletts, the Livingstons, and the Van Rensselaers. These were families that had been in New York for generations, that could trace their lineage back to the Dutch and English settlers, that owned land and brownstones and country estates and seats in the best churches. The swells were representatives of the nouveau riche whom Mrs. Astor had decided, begrudgingly, could participate in polite society. The Vanderbilts were swells. The railroad fortune was only 2 generations old, but Mrs. Astor had admitted them. That was important. It meant that new money could be accepted. Eventually, Mrs. Astor controlled access through a calling card system that operated like a medieval ritual. She would leave her calling card at your home if she deemed you acceptable. A servant would deliver the card, a small piece of engraved cardstock with her name printed in formal script. If she left her card, you could then leave your card at her home. If she did not leave her card, you could not attend her events. Since her events defined the social season, the balls in January, the dinners in February, the parties that everyone who mattered attended, her card determined whether you existed in society at all. The rules were absolute. If Mrs. Astor did not acknowledge you, no one else would either. To go against her was to exile yourself. The rules she enforced were clear. Old money was preferred. Families with lineage, with ancestors who had fought in the Revolution or signed the Constitution or arrived on the Mayflower, were given preference. Proper lineage mattered. European ancestry counted. Appropriate behavior was required. You could have money. You needed money. But money alone was not sufficient. New money could be excluded indefinitely, but new money could also be admitted if the family demonstrated the right qualities over sufficient time, if they built fine houses, if they collected art, if they behaved properly, if they were patient, if they waited. The Vanderbilts had proven it was possible. Alva. Vanderbilt had forced her way into society in 1883 through a combination of persistence and strategic manipulation. She had built a mansion designed by Richard Morris Hunt at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. She had filled it with treasures purchased in Europe, and then she had announced that she would host a costume ball. The most elaborate social event New York had seen in years. 1,200 people would be invited. The cost would exceed $250,000. Everyone wanted to attend, including Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's daughter. There was a problem. Alva Vanderbilt made it clear that Carrie Astor would not receive an invitation unless Mrs. Astor paid a formal call on Alva first. The rule was simple. You could not be invited to someone's home unless you had acknowledged them socially. Mrs. Astor had never acknowledged Alva Vanderbilt, therefore Carrie could not be invited. Mrs. Astor, faced with her daughter's potential exclusion from the social event of the season, relented. She paid the call. She left her card at the Vanderbilt mansion. Alva sent the invitation. Carrie attended the ball. The Vanderbilts were admitted to the 400. The precedent mattered. It meant that new money could force its way in. It meant that wealth, if deployed strategically, could overcome the lack of lineage. But there was a critical detail that everyone who told the Vanderbilt story understood. Alva Vanderbilt had never been a mistress. She had never worked in a gambling parlor. She had never claimed to be a widow when her husband was still alive. Her private life had been respectable. That mattered. Mrs. Astor had accepted the Vanderbilts eventually. They had been new money, too, with fortunes built on railroads, with reputations built on the same ruthless business practices that Collis Huntington had employed. But Alva Vanderbilt's personal conduct met the standards Mrs. Astor required. The stain on Arabella Huntington had been made in Richmond 30 years earlier, and New York society had never forgotten. The story had traveled. Someone who knew someone who had been in Richmond during the war had written a letter. Someone who had done business with John Worsham had mentioned the girl who worked in his establishment. Someone who remembered seeing Collis Huntington in Richmond in the late 1860s had connected the pieces. By the time Arabella arrived in New York in 1869, the story was already circulating. By the time she married Collis in 1884, everyone knew. They knew about John Worsham. They knew he had returned to his wife in Virginia, while Arabella claimed to be a widow in New York. They knew the claim was a lie. The story had circulated through the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue long before Arabella married Collis. The whispers included details. She had worked in Worsham's gambling parlor, not merely patronized it. She had been one of the women who made men feel welcome, who kept them playing, who created the atmosphere that made money flow toward the house. The exact nature of her work was whispered about in conversations that women had behind closed doors. She had not been respectable. That was the conclusion. The living arrangement with Collis while Elizabeth Stoddard Huntington was still alive was known throughout society. The story that Arabella had been hired as a caretaker fooled absolutely no one. The addresses where Collis set her up, West 54th Street, 65 Park Avenue, were not where you housed a servant. The jewelry she wore, the clothes she bought, the investments she made, the business deals she negotiated. These were not the activities of a caretaker. Everyone knew what the arrangement was. Everyone knew what to call it, even if the word mistress was spoken quietly. Archer's resemblance to Collis was obvious to everyone who saw them together. The boy looked like him. He had Collis's features, his build, his mannerisms. As Archer grew from childhood into adolescence, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. When Collis legally adopted Archer in 1884, immediately after marrying Arabella, the adoption confirmed what had been suspected for 15 years. The boy was his. The marriage that same year did not erase the past. It validated the rumors. It proved that everything people had whispered was true. Arabella had been his mistress. Now she was his wife. The sequence mattered. The Vanderbilts had accumulated their fortune through business practices as ruthless as anything Collis Huntington had done. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had crushed competitors, manipulated stock prices, bribed legislators, and exploited workers. His children and grandchildren had continued the practices. They had built their fortune on the same foundations of bribery and corruption and exploitation that the Big Four had used in California. But the difference was not in the business practices. The difference was in the private conduct. Alva Vanderbilt had been born to a good Southern family, the Smiths of Mobile, Alabama. She had married well. She had behaved properly. She had not been a mistress. She had not lied about a dead husband. She had not worked in a gambling parlor. Other families on the 400 list had similar stories. Their business ethics might be questionable. Their fortunes might have been built on practices that reformers and journalists called corrupt. But their personal conduct met the standards Mrs. Astor required. You could be ruthless in business and still be received in society. You could not have been a mistress. That line was absolute. On February 16, 1892, when the 400 list was published in the New York Times, Arabella Huntington's name was not on it. She had been married to Collis for 8 years. She was living in the palazzo that would not be finished for another 2 years, but whose construction had already become the talk of New York. She was wealthy. She was collecting art. She was employing the same architects and artists and decorators that other society families employed. Her name was not on the list. Mrs. Astor never left her calling card at number 2 East 57th Street, the absence. Of the card was a verdict delivered without words. The verdict was delivered not through any public statement, not through any direct communication, but through absence. The calling card did not come. The invitation did not arrive. The list did not include her name. The unspoken rule was absolute. You could be nouveau riche and eventually be admitted if you were patient, and if you behaved properly, and if your private life was respectable. You could not have been a mistress. No amount of money changed that. No palazzo, however expensive. No art collection, however impressive. No entertaining, however lavish, could change what you had been. By 1894, when the palazzo was complete, Arabella understood what she was facing. The verdict had already been delivered. The calling card had not come in 8 years of marriage. It was not coming now, but she would try anyway. For the next 6 years, until Collis died in 1900, she would host dinners, hire the best teachers, and collect the finest art. As if determination alone could rewrite a past that New York society had decided was permanent. She would operate as if the door would eventually open. She would behave as if acceptance was simply a matter of time and effort. She would refuse to acknowledge that the campaign was already lost. She tried anyway. Arabella hosted dinners in the state dining room, multi-course banquets with menus hand-painted by Tiffany and Company. The menus were works of art themselves, each one individually created with elaborate calligraphy and delicate illustrations of flowers and classical scenes. Sometimes the illustrations were painted by artists at Tiffany. Sometimes they were created by Arabella's social secretary and friend, Carrie M. Campbell, who had beautiful handwriting and a talent for decorative design. The menus listed courses that would have taken hours to consume: 8 courses, 10 courses, 12 courses, oysters, soup, fish, sorbet to cleanse the palate, meat, game, salad, dessert, coffee, wines chosen specifically to complement each course, champagne, brandy. The dinners were performances. They demonstrated that Arabella understood how society entertained. They proved she could do it as well as anyone. Presidents attended. Ulysses Grant had dined at her table when he visited New York in the 1880s. William Howard Taft came before his presidency. Theodore Roosevelt came after his. These were not social visits. These were political dinners. Collis was a Republican. He donated to campaigns. He had influence. Presidents needed his support. They came to his house. They ate his food. They sat in his state dining room and listened while he and other railroad executives discussed legislation and regulation and the future of American industry. The president's attendance proved something, but it did not prove what Arabella wanted it to prove. Political acceptance was not social acceptance. Railroad executives and their wives gathered at her table. The Southern Pacific Company held dinners at the Huntington residence. A menu from a Southern Pacific Company dinner on March 23, 1900, is preserved today in the archives at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. The menu lists courses that included consommé, filet of sole, lamb chops, roasted duck, asparagus with hollandaise, endive salad, frozen pudding, and Petit's fours. The wines included Amontillado sherry, Chablis, Chateau Margaux, and champagne. The dinner would have lasted 3 hours. Every detail was perfect. Every course was calculated to demonstrate culture and refinement. The wives of railroad executives attended these dinners. They were not the wives of old money families. They were swells, like Arabella, or they were not even swells. They were just wealthy. Their attendance did not confer the status Arabella sought. On March 1, 1891, Ward McAllister hosted a dinner in honor of Collis P. Huntington. The dinner was held at Delmonico's, the finest restaurant in New York, the place where society gathered for events that were too large or too formal for private homes. McAllister invited members of the 400. He invited knobs and swells. The New York Times covered the event the next day, describing it as significant evidence of the approaching railroad magnate's entrance into New York society. The phrasing was careful. The reporter who wrote the article understood exactly what he was doing. Approaching entrance, not entrance itself, evidence of, not confirmation of. The dinner suggested that Collis might eventually be accepted. It did not suggest that Arabella would be. Around 1894, after the palazzo was finished, Arabella and Collis attended the Patriarch's Ball. The Society of Patriarchs had been founded in 1872 as an organization of the most prominent families in New York. The annual ball in January was one of the most exclusive events of the social season. An invitation to the Patriarch's Ball meant something. It meant you had been recognized. Arabella received an invitation. She attended with Collis. She wore a gown that cost thousands of dollars. She wore jewels that would have fed a working-class family for years. She danced. She conversed. She demonstrated that she could move in society. The invitation was a victory. It was not the victory she wanted. Mrs. Astor attended the Patriarch's Ball. Mrs. Astor did not speak to Arabella. She took voice lessons from Emilio Bellari, a celebrated teacher whose studio was on Fifth Avenue. Bellari's other pupils included Lillian Nordica, one of the most famous sopranos in America, who sang at the Metropolitan Opera and performed in Europe to great acclaim. Bellari also taught society women like Louise Whitfield Carnegie, the wife of Andrew Carnegie, women who were accepted in the best drawing rooms. Learning to sing properly was part of being cultured. It was expected. Arabella studied with Bellari for years. She learned proper breathing technique. She learned to project her voice. She learned art songs by Schubert and Schumann. She studied with the same teacher who taught women born into the families that excluded her. She learned the same repertoire. She sang as well as they did. It did not matter. She escalated her art collecting. The collection that had started with Barbizon landscapes in the 1880s expanded to Old Masters by the 1890s. She competed at auctions for masterpieces. She attended sales at the American Art Association and at the galleries on Fifth Avenue. She bought aggressively. When a Rembrandt came on the market, she bid. When a Vermeer became available through a dealer, she purchased it. The collection at number 2 grew more valuable every year. By 1900, the insurance value exceeded $1 million. $1 million in paintings hanging on the walls of a house where society matrons refused to leave their calling cards. What she achieved was partial. She received invitations to some society events. Not Mrs. Astor's balls, not the most exclusive gatherings of old money families. But she received invitations to events where new money gathered, where swells and aspiring families congregated, where people on the margins of society tried to move toward the center. She gained acceptance in business and political circles. Presidents dined at her table, which was more than most society matrons could claim. She was acknowledged in newspapers as a hostess. She was mentioned in society columns, though usually in connection with Collis's business activities rather than in the purely social context that Mrs. Astor's name appeared. People acknowledged her as a cultured collector with sophisticated taste. Dealers sought her out. Museum curators visited her picture gallery to view works they hoped she might eventually donate. Art critics mentioned her collection in articles about American collectors. She had achieved something. She had transformed herself from the girl in the Richmond gambling parlor into a woman whose taste was respected by experts. But what she never achieved was the calling card from Mrs. Astor. She never made the 400 list. Full acceptance by the core of old money society remained out of reach. She had come closer than most women with her background ever could have. That August, as summer heat settled over New York and wealthy families retreated to country estates and seaside resorts, she had no way of knowing that the campaign was about to end, and that she would spend the rest of her life as the richest woman in America, whom Mrs. Caroline Astor never received. Collis Potter Huntington died on August 13, 1900, at Raquette Lake in upstate New York. He was at his summer camp, a rustic retreat where wealthy men went to fish and hunt and escape the heat of the city. He was 78 years old. He had been complaining of chest pains for several days. The doctor who attended him could do nothing. The death was attributed to heart disease, which is what doctors called most deaths in men his age when they did not know the specific cause. He died in the morning. Arabella was with him. The news reached New York by telegraph that afternoon. The newspapers ran obituaries the next day. They described him as a railroad magnate, as one of the wealthiest men in America, as a man who had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. They listed his accomplishments. They did not mention the bribery or the corruption or the methods he had used. Arabella inherited more than $50 million, approximately $1.5 billion in current value when adjusted for inflation and changes in the economy. The inheritance made her one of the wealthiest women in the United States. Archer also inherited a substantial sum from the man who had adopted him. The exact amount is not recorded, but estate documents suggest it was in the millions. Collis had taken care of the boy. Archer would never need to work. Arabella continued living primarily at No. 2 East 57th Street. The palazzo had been built for a campaign. The campaign was over. Collis was dead. Mrs. Astor had not received her. But the house remained. She stayed. She would live there for the next 24 years. Her art collecting escalated from ambitious to extraordinary. With $50 million and no one to answer to, she could buy anything. She developed relationships with the most powerful art dealers in the world. Joseph Duveen and his uncle Henry Duveen controlled Duveen Brothers, a firm that bought entire collections from European aristocrats and sold them piece by piece to American millionaires. Jacques Seligmann operated from Paris with connections to noble families across Europe who needed to sell paintings and furniture and tapestries to pay debts or maintain estates. These men controlled access to the greatest private collections in Europe, When aristocratic families needed to sell their treasures, Duveen and Seligmann bought them and sold them to American millionaires who wanted to acquire culture by the crate. In November of 1907, Duveen Brothers purchased the entire Rudolphe Kann collection in Paris for $17 million. The Kann collection was one of the finest private art collections in Europe, assembled over decades by a wealthy banker. It included paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals, and other Dutch masters. It included French furniture from the 18th century. It included tapestries, sculpture, decorative objects. Duveen bought all of it. Arabella bought a significant portion of it. She purchased paintings. She purchased furniture. She purchased objects that had belonged to French kings and that now would belong to her. The total she spent is not recorded precisely, but estimates suggest millions. In 1909, she purchased a Gobelins tapestry suite from Jacques Seligmann for approximately $3 million. The Gobelins tapestries had been woven in the royal workshops in Paris in the 18th century. They depicted classical scenes, gods and goddesses, and mythological narratives woven in silk and wool with gold and silver thread. They were museum-quality pieces. She intended them for the house that belonged to Collis's nephew, Henry Edwards Huntington, in San Marino, California. She was already planning for the future. Arabella became known in the press as the richest woman in the country. The designation was probably accurate. Her personal fortune from investments, combined with her inheritance from Collis, made her wealthier than almost any woman in America. The press treated her wealth as a curiosity. Articles appeared with titles like "The Richest Woman in America" and "How Mrs. Huntington Spends Her Millions." The articles described her art collecting, her homes, her charitable donations. They did not mention that Mrs. Astor had never received her. That would have been improper to print. She gave away substantial sums. In 1902, she donated $100,000 to establish the Huntington Fund for Cancer Research at General Memorial Hospital in New York. The donation was made in Collis's name. The fund supported research into treatments for a disease that killed tens of thousands of Americans every year. The fund would eventually grow into Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one of the leading cancer research hospitals in the world. She gave $250,000 to Harvard Medical School for a laboratory. She gave $20,000 to Tuskegee University in Alabama to build Huntington Hall, a dormitory for female students at the school that Booker T. Washington had founded to educate Black Americans. Her philanthropy was substantial. It was also strategic. Donations to prestigious institutions carried social weight. Her social position remained fundamentally unchanged. She had $50 million. She had one of the finest art collections in private hands in America. She attended events. She was acknowledged, but the core of old money society still held her at a distance. Mrs. Astor died on October 30th, 1908, at the age of 78, at her mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue. The woman who had kept Arabella out was gone. The newspapers ran obituaries. The funeral was attended by everyone who mattered in New York. Mrs. Astor's death created a brief period of uncertainty about who would replace her as the arbiter of society. Several women attempted to claim the role, but the rules she had established survived her. And Arabella, despite $50 million and one of the finest art collections in America, remained outside them. Henry Edwards Huntington was born in 1850 in Oneonta, New York, the same year as Arabella, though she claimed to be younger. He was Collis's nephew, the son of Collis's brother. He had grown up working in the family businesses, learning railroads and real estate and finance from his uncle. By 1913, he had built his own railroad fortune, managing the Pacific Electric Railway in Southern California, an interurban rail system that connected Los Angeles to surrounding cities, and that made him tens of millions of dollars when he sold the company. He was wealthy, independent of Collis. He was respected in business. He had been married before to Mary Alice Prentice, with whom he had 4 children. He divorced her to marry Arabella. On July 16, 1913, Henry and Arabella were married in Paris. The ceremony was discreet. They did not announce it publicly until weeks later. Arabella was 63 years old, though she told people she was younger. She had been telling people she was younger for decades, shaving years off her age on every official document, changing her birth year in conversations, creating confusion that would persist long after her death. Henry was 63. The marriage united two fortunes, but critically. Their finances remained completely separate. Arabella kept control of her own money. Henry controlled his. The arrangement was documented in legal papers drawn up before the marriage. It was deliberate. Arabella had learned from experience. She would not be dependent again. Henry had built a mansion on his property in San Marino, California, between 1908 and 1910. The estate covered 500 acres of land that had once been a Mexican ranch. It included botanical gardens that Henry had begun developing, planting rare trees and flowers and creating specialized sections devoted to different climates and regions. It included agricultural operations, orchards and vineyards and experimental plantings. It included a growing collection of rare books and manuscripts that Henry had been acquiring for years. First editions and medieval illuminated manuscripts and documents signed by American founders. The mansion was built in a Beaux-Arts style, smaller than the Huntington Palazzo in New York, but substantial, designed to house a library and art collection and to accommodate guests. After the marriage, Arabella moved between 4 properties seasonally. She spent November and December at No. 2 East 57th Street in New York, hosting dinners and observing the holidays in the city where she had fought her unsuccessful campaign for acceptance. She spent the winter and spring months at the San Marino Ranch in California, where the climate was mild and where society was newer and less concerned with her past. She traveled to Europe in the summer, staying at Chateau de Beauregard, a property the couple owned in France, where she could visit dealers and attend auctions and purchase art. On weekends and during autumn, she stayed at Huntington Homestead, the family estate at Throgs Neck in Westchester County, New York, a large property overlooking Long Island Sound, where the Huntington family had maintained a home for decades. The staff at No. 2 East 57th Street numbered 21 by 1916 and 1917, according to household records preserved in archives. The staff included a butler who managed the other servants, an under-butler who assisted him, a housekeeper who oversaw the cleaning and maintenance, ladies' maids who attended to Arabella's wardrobe and personal needs, housemaids who cleaned the public rooms, laundry maids who washed linens, kitchen maids who assisted the cooks who prepared meals, footmen who served at table and attended to guests, a valet who attended to Henry's needs, and various specialized servants whose jobs had specific titles. Each servant was paid a wage. Each lived in the house or in nearby accommodations. Each understood that their employment depended on performance and discretion. In August of 1919, Arabella and Henry signed an indenture together. The document was prepared by lawyers and executed with formality. It stated that upon their deaths, the 500-acre San Marino estate would become a public institution. It would be called the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. The property would house Henry's collection of rare books and manuscripts, which by 1919 included some of the most valuable books in America: a Gutenberg Bible, the Ellesmere manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, first editions of Shakespeare, letters written by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. The property would house Arabella's collection of art, which she had been systematically moving to California, transferring paintings and furniture from New York to San Marino. The public would be able to visit. Scholars would be able to study the collections. The institution would serve education and culture. Both of them signed the document as co-founders. Arabella's signature appears on the indenture alongside Henry's. The document is preserved in the archives at the Huntington Library. It proves that she was not merely Henry's wife, not merely the woman who advised him on art purchases. She was a co-founder. She had equal standing in the creation of the institution. The indenture was signed in August of 1919. She had 5 years left to live. Their joint collecting continued. Henry focused on rare books and manuscripts, acquiring materials at a pace that astonished dealers and librarians. He purchased entire libraries from English aristocrats. He bought collections from American families who needed money. He paid prices that set records. Arabella advised him on art purchases and continued building her own collection. She bought paintings. She bought French furniture, Louis Fourteenth chairs and Louis Fifteenth commodes, and tables and cabinets that had belonged to French nobility. She bought Sèvres porcelain and silver and objects that came with provenance tracing them to Versailles and to the royal palaces that had been emptied during the French Revolution. The 18th century Boucher tapestries that Henry purchased for the San Marino mansion cost more than the mansion itself had cost to build. That was the scale at which they operated. The Huntington Library would be their joint legacy, signed into existence in August of 1919. But Arabella spent her final years primarily in New York, in the palazzo she had built, a quarter-century earlier, to force a door that had never fully opened. She returned to California seasonally. She advised on the installation of art at San Marino. She worked with landscape architects to design gardens. But No. 2 East 57th Street remained her primary residence. It was where she felt most herself, even though it was also where she had failed most completely. Arabella Duval Huntington died on September 16, 1924, at her mansion at No. 2 East 57th Street. She was 74 years old, though she had claimed various ages throughout her life. In letters to her son Archer, written in the early 1900s, she had joked that she was getting younger every year, that time was moving backward for her. The joke had been based in deception. She had systematically lied about her age for decades, changing dates on documents, telling different stories to different people, creating confusion that would persist long after her death. After she died, Henry had to write to Archer to ask for her actual birth date, because she had told so many different stories that no one knew the truth. Archer provided what information he had, but even he was not certain. Her entire fortune and art collections passed to Archer Milton Huntington. He had become one of the world's leading experts on Spanish poetry and literature. He had founded the Hispanic Society of America in New York City in 1904, building a museum and library devoted to Spanish and Portuguese art and culture. He had never married. He had never had children. He would spend his inheritance supporting the Hispanic Society and other cultural institutions. He would give away millions. He would die in 1955 at the age of 85, one of the last direct links to the Gilded Age. Arabella's body was transported by train to San Marino, California. The mausoleum where she would be buried had been designed by John Russell Pope, the architect who would later design the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. Pope was the leading classical architect in America in the 1920s. The mausoleum he designed for the Huntingtons was built from Colorado Yule marble, the same marble used for the Lincoln Memorial. A circular peristyle surrounded the interior, columns in the classical style holding up a domed roof. 4 bas-relief sculptures decorated the walls, each depicting a season with literary quotes alluding to the passage of time. The mausoleum was completed in 1929, 5 years after Arabella's death and 2 years after Henry's. It sits on a hill at the San Marino estate, visible from the gardens, a monument to both of them. Anderson Galleries in New York held a major auction of the contents of No. 2 East 57th Street in the months after Arabella's death. Archer decided to sell most of his mother's belongings to raise money for the Hispanic Society of America, which needed funds to expand its building and acquire new collections. The auction catalogs ran to hundreds of pages. Items were listed with descriptions and provenance: furniture, silver, china, rugs, clocks, decorative objects. Everything was photographed and cataloged and offered for sale. Henry Edwards Huntington bought back many of the French antiques at the auction, purchasing items that he wanted for the San Marino mansion, or that he thought belonged in the collection they had built together. He paid substantial sums to reacquire chairs and tables and commodes that Arabella had purchased years earlier. The objects traveled from New York to California and were installed in the San Marino mansion, where they remain today. 20 to 30 paintings from the collection went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The exact number depends on how you count works donated versus works purchased by the museum at favorable prices. The donations included the 2 Rembrandts that Arabella had purchased in the 1890s, the Vermeer, and works by Reynolds and Gainsborough and other artists whose names carried weight. The museum accepted the donations gratefully. The paintings hang today in galleries that bear no mention of Arabella Huntington, though the museum's records document the provenance. Many of the murals and architectural elements went to Yale University. Collis's will had stipulated that if Archer died without children, the contents of the mansion would go to Yale. Collis had contributed money to Yale in his lifetime. The university had named a building after him. The will was honored after Arabella's death, even though Archer was still alive. The murals that Elihu Vedder had painted for the family dining room were removed from the walls and shipped to New Haven. They were installed in a building on the Yale campus. The carved wood panels, the decorative elements, the architectural details that had taken years to create. These were carefully removed and preserved and given to the university. In 1926, the palazzo at number 2 East 57th Street was demolished. Only 2 years had passed since Arabella's death. Only 33 years had passed since the palazzo had been completed. The building was structurally sound. It could have stood for centuries, but the property was valuable. The location at 5th Avenue and 57th Street was one of the most expensive addresses in New York. Developers wanted the land. Archer, who had inherited the property, sold it. The palazzo was torn down. The stone was carted away. The lot was cleared. Within months, a commercial building rose on the site. Henry Edwards Huntington died on May 23, 1927, in Philadelphia. He was visiting the city for meetings related to his library. He suffered a heart attack. He was 77 years old. His body was transported to San Marino and buried next to Arabella in the mausoleum that John Russell Pope had designed. They lie there together today, the man who built a library and the woman who built a palace, united in death in a way they never quite were in life. Within 2 years of Arabella's death, the palazzo was gone. The lot where it had stood, at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street, became something other than a monument to ambition. The commercial building that replaced it has since been replaced by another building. The site has no marker, no plaque, no indication that one of the most expensive private residences in New York once stood there. What Arabella had built there, what she had spent $2.5 million creating, see what she had filled with treasures and hopes and determination, lasted 33 years. But what she built in California has lasted approaching a century. The Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens opened to the public in 1927, the year of Henry's death. The institution that both of them signed into existence in August of 1919 has become one of the major cultural landmarks in Southern California. More than 600,000 people visit every year. They walk through the mansion that Arabella helped furnish. They view paintings from the collection she assembled, the French furniture she purchased, the tapestries she acquired, the decorative arts she studied and selected. They stroll through botanical gardens on 500 acres that she and Henry left to the public. The Huntington Library houses Henry's collection of rare books and manuscripts, materials that scholars travel from around the world to study. The institution operates on an endowment that came from both their fortunes. It employs hundreds of people. It offers fellowships to scholars. It hosts exhibitions. It preserves materials that document American and British history. It maintains gardens that include one of the finest collections of cacti in the world, a Japanese garden, a Chinese garden, a rose garden, and a Shakespeare garden. The institution has expanded far beyond what Arabella and Henry envisioned in 1919. But the foundation they created, the collections they assembled, the resources they provided, these made everything that followed possible. Arabella never made Mrs. Astor's 400 list. She never received Mrs. Astor's calling card. She never achieved full acceptance by the old money families of Fifth Avenue, despite decades of effort and millions of dollars spent on a palazzo designed to force open doors that remained closed. She hosted presidents but never convinced the women who mattered most that she belonged. She built the finest private residence on the most fashionable corner in New York and died having never been invited to the parties across the street. But millions of people have visited the Huntington Library since it opened in 1927. The institution bearing the Huntington name exists because she co-signed the indenture in 1919. What she built for society's approval was demolished in 1926, 2 years after her death. What she built for public benefit approaches its centennial. The character of Sylvia Chamberlain in the HBO series The Gilded Age was inspired by Arabella's story. The show's creators took the outline of her life, the questionable origins, the relationship with a powerful man, the attempt to force entry into society, the palace built as a weapon, and dramatized it for television. Arabella would have appreciated the irony. A century after her death, her story is told to millions of viewers who watch a fictionalized version of the woman who worked in a gambling parlor in Richmond and became a co-founder of one of America's great cultural institutions. She spent $2.5 million in 33 years trying to force her way into the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. The palazzo was her weapon in a campaign she could never win. It was built to prove she belonged, to demonstrate that she understood culture and taste and refinement, to show that she was worthy of acknowledgement. It stood for 3 decades and was torn down 2 years after she died. The door that opened was not the one she had tried to unlock. Today, visitors to the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, walk past her mausoleum on their way to the gardens. They explore gardens she helped create, sections she planned with landscape architects, plants she selected. They view art she collected, paintings she purchased at auctions in Paris and New York, furniture she acquired from dealers who sold her objects that had belonged to French kings. Most of them have never heard of the Palazzo at number 2 East 57th Street. Most of them do not know about the calling card that never came or the list that never included her name. They do not know about the 18 years she spent trying to force her way into a society that had decided she was unacceptable. They experience her actual legacy, the institution she co-founded, the collection she assembled, the gardens she helped design, completely unaware of the monument she thought would define her. The palazzo is gone. The library endures. That is how history remembers Arabella Huntington.